Welcome. Thank you for joining us today for the fourth session examining Bob Johansen's book. We're delighted to have you all here with us in person and on Zoom. I'm delighted today to welcome everyone, particularly to this session that will look at Bob's book in light of social movements and international organizations. The focus question for this panel is, can transnational social movements build sufficient strength to move the United States and other great powers to build international institutions capable of implementing a global grand strategy for peace and human security? Just a small topic that we'll be taking on today. As those of you who were in last session may remember that was referenced in some of Richard Falk's questions about what can social movements do in civil society in moving us forward. To address this question today, we have three distinguished panelists whom I'll introduce, and then I'll let them make their remarks. David Courtwright is Professor Emeritus of the Practice at Notre Dame, and David has written widely about nonviolent social change, nuclear disarmament, and the use of multilateral sanctions and incentives as tools for international peacemaking. He's the author or co-editor of more than 20 books, including Waging Peace in Vietnam and Governance for Peace. Other works include Gandhi and Beyond, Nonviolence for a New Political Age, and Peace, A History of Movements and Ideas. Together with George Lopez, he has written or co-edited a series of major works on multilateral sanctions, including Smart Sanctions and the Search for Security. David's scholarship grows out of a long history of public advocacy for disarmament and the prevention of war, beginning with speaking out against the Vietnam War while he was an active duty soldier. In 1978, he was named executive director of SANE, the Committee for a Sane Nuclear Policy, which under his leadership grew from 4,000 to 150,000 members and became the largest disarmament organization in the United States. He was actively involved in the nuclear freeze movement of the 80s, and in 2002 helped create Win Without War, a coalition of national organizations that opposed the invasion of Iraq. David earned a BA from Notre Dame in 1968, so before Bob was here teaching, an MA from New York University, and a PhD from Union Institute in Washington, D.C. Welcome, David. Mark Fatima Massoud is a professor of politics at the University of California, Santa Cruz, and a visiting professor of law at the University of Oxford. Mark is the recipient of a Guggenheim Fellowship as well as Carnegie Fellowship, and is the author of 2 books investigating the relationship between law, religion, and politics in the making of nation states. His first book, Law's Fragile State, Colonial, Authoritarian, and Humanitarian Legacies in Sudan, earned awards from the American Political Science Association and the Law and Society Association. His second book is Sharia Inshallah, Finding God in Somali Legal Politics. Sharia Inshallah has received 4 book awards this year, including the Ralph Bunche Award from the American Political Science Association for the best book in ethnic and cultural pluralism, and the Distinguished Book Award from the American Sociological Association section on religion. Mark will be discussing his book Sharia Inshallah tomorrow at 12:30 at the Kellogg Institute. Mark earned his JD and PhD from the University of California, Berkeley, but more importantly, completed his BA and MA in Peace Studies at Notre Dame, where he was a student of Bob Johansen. Anne Mische is Associate Professor of Sociology and Peace Studies at Notre Dame. Her research focuses on communication, deliberation, and leadership in social movements and democratic politics. Her first book, Partisan Publics, Communication and Contention Across Brazilian Youth Activist Networks, examines the relationship between partisanship and civic association in Brazilian youth politics during 20 years of democratic restructuring. Anne's currently working on a book in the role of futures thinking and foresight methodologies in social and political change efforts across global networks focusing on democracy, development, peace building, and climate change. This project builds on her previous theoretical work on how cultural construction of the future influences actions, relations, and political processes. Anne has served as chair of 2 sections of the American Sociological Association, Political Sociology and Theory, and as co-editor of Social Movements Studies, a journal of social cultural and political protest. She earned her BA from Yale and MA and PhD from the New School for Social Research. Welcome to our panelists, and we will start with David Courtwright.
Thank you, Anne. I want to begin by joining others in thanking Bob for his leadership all through the years, and especially to pay tribute to you, Bob, for your role in founding the Kroc Institute. Many people don't realize that Bob was, I guess, our first faculty member and really had an incredibly important contribution of developing the academic rigor and scholarship of our peace studies curriculum here at Notre Dame. It wasn't an easy job to sell this conservative university on the idea of peace studies as a new discipline worthy of a full program. And in order to assure the credibility and legitimacy of peace studies as a discipline, Bob made heroic efforts to really make sure that our curriculum was first class. And many of the MA students who took his courses would have to read hundreds of pages and struggle through rigorous scholarship requirements that Bob imposed, but it was essential. And that's a less known but an important legacy of your academic work, Bob, and thank you for that. In my remarks, I want to talk about the question of movements and maybe give an example that most haven't thought about recently in relation to the Iraq War and the United Nations. And then lastly, say a few words about motivation for social action. In the final pages of Bob's book, he expresses a belief in the value of educating, organizing, and acting in social movements for justice and peace. And as you've heard from my introduction through Anne, I've spent most of my life planning and organizing and participating in and writing about such movements. And Bob has been a participant in some of those movements. He mentioned at the outset marching for nuclear disarmament in 40 years ago. That was the rally for freezing and reversing the nuclear arms race. I was part of the organizing committee for that rally. And it was just one of many movements. And I believe that these kinds of social movements and political mobilization in general, these are absolutely essential to the prospects for applying the evidence that Bob assembles in his book and for realizing the proposals that he makes. Richard Falk mentioned in the last section that in order to move these ideas forward, we need traction. We need to get political traction for them. Well, I would submit that traction requires friction. There needs to be pressure. There needs to be political resistance and contestation in order to force the political establishments to take action. And I think most of the significant advances for human security over the last decades and centuries have resulted from social engagement, from civil society pressure. History is shaped from the bottom up. Sometimes it's also shaped from the top down. But most significant movements for human security have come in that way. And Bob gives some wonderful examples. He has a table there in the last pages, page 349, listing a whole range of examples that we could talk about. One that I think is not addressed as much as it should be was the women's agenda for women, peace, and security, which evolved from the International Women's Congresses that started, well, we know about the Beijing conference in 1995, but before that there were the Mexico City and Copenhagen and Nairobi conferences in which the UN convened these assemblies, and thousands of women came from civil society to be there alongside the diplomats and the representatives of states, demanding that women have equality in international affairs and that security required the involvement of women. And there are many, many other examples. This marvelous book that Una Hathaway and Shapiro wrote, The Internationalists, which really talks about the whole agenda of internationalism and international organization and the outlawing of war, evolved from society, from, in this case, lawyers and some international scholars who recognized the core international principles and began to build a movement for international organization and then principles of international law. So there are many examples. I want to focus on one here for a moment on the relating to the Iraq War. I just finished a new book on the history of the Iraq anti-war movement, so a little self-promotion here for advanced promotion for the book, but it's something I've written about elsewhere. The conventional narrative is, well, you had this worldwide movement, the biggest protests against war in history, and yet the US and Britain invaded Iraq, ergo the movement was a failure. I think that's too narrow of an interpretation. And there are ways in which the movement had significant impacts, and probably most significantly was at the international level. And just to remind you of a bit of the history, in February and March of '03, the US and Britain went back to the Security Council to seek a resolution authorizing the use of force. And they were decisively rebuffed. Russia, France, Germany, and other non-permanent members refused to buckle under the pressure that the US was applying. And there was tremendous political mobilization in many of these countries, in Mexico, in Chile, Pakistan, and Germany certainly, that were mobilizing against this war. So after a few weeks of this, the US could only muster the votes of Britain and Bulgaria and Spain. By the way, Spain's government was then voted out of office a few months later. And so they gave up the operation and just went ahead and invaded without UN approval. And this cumulative impact of political opposition at the UN, reflected at the UN, prevented the Bush administration from internationalizing the war. And as a result, the US and Britain stood alone in the drive for war and in having to fight the war. This rebuff by the Security Council is significant. Scholar Emanuel Wallerstein wrote years ago that this is the first time since the UN was founded that the United States, on an issue that really mattered to it, could not get a majority on the Security Council. And the result was a widely recognized political defeat for the supposed lone superpower. And there was an interplay between the anti-war movement and the Security Council diplomats. Most officials at the UN and in the Security Council opposed this war. They were appalled, but they couldn't stop it. The structure of the UN, by its very design, is a captive of the permanent powers. And when its most powerful member is bent on war, as was the case then and is the case now with Putin's war in Ukraine, the UN has no capacity to prevent it. The only power the UN really has is whether to confer international legitimacy. And when it withholds that consent, as it did in Iraq, it denies legitimacy and political support. And it did so as a result of the anti-war movement. There was a kind of a dialectic that developed at that time between the council members and civil society organizations. The public opposition, those of us who are organizing opposition, made the lack of UN authorization a key issue. No war without UN approval. Now, many of us would have opposed the war no matter what, but that was the political agenda. And the stronger the anti-war movement in Germany, France, Canada, and other countries, the greater the determination of UN diplomats to resist US pressures. And then the stronger the objections at the UN, the greater the legitimacy and political impact of the anti-war movement. It was a unique and I think quite unprecedented form of global political synergy. By defending the UN, despite its many shortcomings, and insisting upon international authorization for the use of force, the peace movement tried to build respect for the institution and for international law. The Bush administration decried the UN for, quote, failing its responsibilities. But many in the anti-war movement felt that this was one of the shining moments of the organization. By standing up to Washington, the Council displayed rare political courage and integrity and attempted to fulfill the UN's actual mission to prevent war. And it's well noted by many scholars, and a bit of irony, that the UN Charter begins with "we the peoples," but the actual functioning of the organization is through governments. But during the Iraq War, people rose up and cried out against war and worked through the UN and helped to voice and make possible the organization's mission of peace. And I think this is a pattern and a lesson for us in the future, and one that's been reflected through history. And some of the most important norms and agendas for international security and human security have emerged from civil society. You know, the very concepts that we take for granted that we've been using here in this discussion, human rights, internationalism, many of these ideas came out of society. They weren't decided by governments. They came through social movements. I think these movements are critically important. As I said, I don't think it's going to be possible to bring about these changes without continued pressure and more effective and larger movements. Let me just close with a thought about motivation, because Bob finishes his book with some poignant comments like this. Peacemaking is a difficult enterprise. I call it, it's an existential task. Like Sisyphus, we roll the boulder up the hill and it keeps rolling back down again, and we end one war and another starts. And what can motivate us in this action? I think for many of us it is a matter of faith. We are called by our faith, the Catholic faith, Christianity, Islam, and other traditions call us to be peacemakers. And so working for peace is how we express our faith. I found in my life, and I think many have, that the work for peace gives us purpose in life. It gives us meaning, a meaning that is in the spirit of love, not of hate. And I'm grateful to Bob in the final pages where he talks about the experience of working against war can bring a sense of joy in the being able to sacrifice for a cause that's greater than ourselves. And I thought of this as a title for a new work that I'm starting to put together. The joy of resistance. When I was resisting the Vietnam War as a soldier, it was scary, it was frightening, it was frustrating, disappointing, but it was also fun in a way, and it was fulfilling. And I think for all of us, we can understand that struggling for justice and peace is what gives meaning to our lives. It's difficult. We never achieve exactly what we want. Often there are failures. But we can achieve progress, and I think it's the only way that progress is going to be realized. Thank you.
Thank you very much, David. And next we'll hear from Mark Massoud.
All right, it's a pleasure to be here. Thanks all of you for coming as well. As we've seen so far today, Bob's book is a passionate call to rethink the path to peace. This path involves putting human security ahead of ahead of national security in global politics. So I'm, as Anne mentioned, one of 700 alumni of the MA program in Peace Studies here at the Kroc Institute. So the question of this afternoon's panel about the role of individuals, the role of social movements in building and protecting human security, it's at the center of what I care about and what I studied from people like Bob and also David here on this panel, among many others. So in my remarks today, I want to share what I liked about this book. I want to talk about why I like this book. And then I want to pose 3 questions that emerged for me from reading the book. So there's lots to like about Bob's book. It has careful analysis and argumentation. It's something that should be assigned to graduate students because it also has clear writing. I don't think we share that enough with colleagues who write clearly, that it's clearly written, which makes it a pleasure to read. I appreciate the normative places that Bob wants us to go, which I share and agree with. Another thing I love about this book is that it's daring. In a world that is rife with militias, militaries, weapons, Bob puts forth, and he's done this before, but I think this book, he puts it stronger than he's ever done before, the case for a humanist approach to international relations. So for Bob, ethics, peace, social and environmental justice, these are not alternatives to military intervention. Military intervention is the alternative to all those things that then come first and always should come first. So the book recenters and affirms the work that NGOs, non-governmental organizations, have been doing around the world. Some of these staff members are Bob's former students, my former colleagues in the MA program. Some of them live in the places where I've done my field work in Sudan, in Somalia. Bob says early in the book, around page 43, that if you want good global governance, it is achieved in part because of the pressure from all of these groups around the world. The good global governance, it doesn't exist without these pressure groups. So in a sense, Bob's already answered the question for this panel, how essential these groups are. So that's some of what I loved about this and appreciated about this book. It's a well-written, passionate, and clear path to shift international relations, scholarship, and policy in a way that I think validates much of the work of NGOs around the world. The book also led me to ask 3 questions. I mean, many questions, but there are 3 I just want to kind of introduce in today's panel. One is about American hegemony or US hegemony. The other one is about the role of social media and technology. And the third is about humility. And I'm not an expert on any of these. I introduce these questions because I am searching for answers too. I don't have the answers to these questions. So let me start with US hegemony. So the US is, I think rightfully, the book's primary audience. The US is also the source of many of the problems that the book documents, especially around chapters 2 through 4, which are kind of harrowing to read, this litany of problems that the United States created domestically, but especially in its foreign policy around the world. And in the book, Bob argues that the US can provide solutions that the US itself created. And then toward the end of the book, this is on page 313, Bob reminds us, and he uses this language, he says, the US is also, quote, on a suicidal path. And this path started long before the 2016 election, Bob says. So on the one hand, I read this and I thought, this is sort of like inviting someone who is on a suicidal path to try to save the world. And that doesn't seem very promising. But even if the US were not on this suicidal path that Bob says it is on, in the parts of the world I study, solutions that come from the United States are often met with distrust precisely because they come from the United States. It's another top-down imposition that when you're on the ground in these places looks not dissimilar to what their parents and grandparents went through with colonial interventions a century or 50, 60, 70, 80 some odd years ago. So should the US or even US-based NGOs and social movements be taking the lead on the path to peace? Or might Bob, might all of us consider being even more revolutionary, inviting the United States to finally take a back seat? I'm not sure such a path is practical or feasible or even possible, or how, if it is possible, but I think it's worth discussing as maybe not a short-term, but potentially a long-term inquiry in what that means for global politics. So that's the first kind of set of questions around US hegemony. The second is on the role of social media and technology. So Bob says, also later in the book, he says, not many people are prepared psychologically to live in a global society, the one he advocates for, that I agree with. It's hard to disagree with. He says this around page 327. And this made me wonder, especially in light of the previous part of the book, about the new, increasingly global online societies that people are living in. So we live in an age right now where 46%, nearly half of American teenagers, have said that they are either constantly or nearly constantly online. There's a recent documentary film called We Met in Virtual Reality, and it features these people. It's entirely filmed in virtual reality, and it features people who are doing their hobbies and meeting and falling in love and getting married and creating friendships entirely in virtual reality without ever leaving their apartments and certainly not even getting up from their desks. They're living these entire lives outside of nation-state borders. They're creating these kind of closed societies with virtual reality goggles on. So our social units as humans are simultaneously becoming more global, which Bob argues in the book, our social units are becoming more global, but they're also paradoxically getting smaller. They're made up of a few dozen or maybe a few hundred or thousand if you're young people, friends on TikTok or Instagram or through your virtual reality goggles. So my question is, what does this future of social media, not just around misinformation, the kinds of things Bob talks about in the book, but actually around the future of living in social media, which maybe our children or grandchildren are probably going to be doing. What does this future of living in social media, where nations start to erode and lose their relevance? I mean, it's no surprise Facebook wants to create a constitutional court. Facebook wants to create its own currency. It's no surprise Facebook is becoming a kind of its own nation builder, or meta as it's now called. As nation states lose their relevance, what does this tell us about the role of people and social movements in this whole new virtual architecture that we seem to be barreling towards in promoting human security? So that's a second set of questions around the role of social media and technology. And then the final question, which is kind of the hardest for me to describe, is around humility. In chapter 5, around page 165, Bob cites to the philosopher Immanuel Kant. And Kant says, look, it takes a lot of work to establish peace. Peace is not the natural state of affairs. War is probably, or violence or conflict is the natural state of affairs. And it takes a lot of work to establish a state of peace. And people like David know how much work it takes to fight for peace. And that made me want to ask, before we even reach policymakers or NGOs or activist networks, or the people we write about and work with in our scholarship, is it necessary for us to establish a state of peace within ourselves? This is getting really abstract for me, but kind of bear with me. Do we need to establish a kind of state of inner peace within ourselves? Is that necessary? Is the starting point for peace, maybe for political realists, it's amassing weapons? Maybe for people like Bob, it's social and environmental justice. But is it maybe even deeper than that? Is it individual people submitting to their own higher authority? Humility, be it religious faith or God or the rule of law or some other higher authority. And Bob alludes to this actually very early on and very quickly and very briefly in a part of the book that very few people read, and that is the acknowledgments. In the acknowledgments, he says he learned from his parents that, quote, the nation state is not the highest authority in life. And I think Bob's on to something here, and that is something about humility, submitting ourselves to some higher authority, some higher power, that can be the starting point to achieving peace, social peace. Or maybe that's the starting point to what Bob was talking about in the first couple of sessions, Amartya Sen's capabilities approach that Martha Nussbaum adopted and that Bob himself adopts. Okay, so let me summarize. This is a beautiful book. I have my copy in my bag. I want it autographed, so you're not leaving until I get it autographed. And I hope that many people see this book far beyond today's conference. It opens up spaces in international relations, in U.S. foreign policy, in peace studies, including on the three issues that it opened up for me on U.S. hegemony, on thinking about the future of technology and social media, and then thinking about humility and what that means in its relationship to peace. So, Bob, I'm grateful that you wrote this book and that you continue to fight for these values that I hold so strongly and that I think our discipline of political science has oftentimes shied away from. So I'm really glad you're here and you're fighting this fight. I appreciate it and I agree with it and I'm on it. So thank you.
Thank you very much, Mark. Wonderful comments. Next, we'll hear from Mische.
All right, thanks, Anne. So I'd like to start by offering an appreciation. Reading this book felt in many ways like coming home. My parents, Pat and Jerry Mische, were involved in the kind of internationalist education and coalition building that Bob really eloquently describes in this book. In fact, they worked directly with Bob on many issues related to world order alternatives in the 70s and 80s. So I found it refreshing and also comforting to hear Bob's full-throated defense of a global grand strategy grounded in humanistic values of mutual responsibility, cooperation, and concern for the earth and its people. Bob offers us a confident belief in the coordinating power of international law and institutions, while at the same time trying to stay clear-eyed and realistic about the dangers and the difficulties of our times. So while I was reassured by Bob's optimism, I was also struck by a tension in the emotional tone of this book. And I think actually Mark referred to this a bit. You know, Bob doesn't shy away from the many problems that often sink us into despair and paralysis. You called several chapters harrowing, and I kind of felt that mood as well. In chapter 8, he tells us all the many reasons why building a transnational social movement in support of this global grand strategy is really hard, from electoral college manipulation, gerrymandering, voter suppression, lack of public debate, to political dishonesty, fake news, cyber warfare, disinformation, and the corrupting influence of money on politics. He tells us in clear and unflinching terms why we should and why we must act to move beyond these distressing and dangerous realities. At the same time, he doesn't let us rest in our distress. He works hard, especially in the final chapter of the book, to move from what I might call the exhortational mode, the must and the should, to the conditional and the dynamic. I really like modal verbs, so I'm very attentive to your use of modal verbs in the book. He tells us what could happen to move beyond these problems. There's a lot of could in this book. And he tells us what we can do ourselves as citizens and as educators. He tries to lift us up, insisting on a politics of possibility. He tells us that another world is within our reach, backed up by empirical evidence, and not contrary to human nature. So the experience of reading the book is a bit of an emotional roller coaster, although I'd say that Bob's always prophetic voice brings us back up to the mountaintop and fuels us with potential energy for the journey ahead. So why is Bob so optimistic? First, he's quite clear that these changes that he calls for, the musts and the should, will not come of their own accord. He argues, quoting to quote, that bold citizens' movements, tempered by open discussion of key questions with those with whom one disagrees, can, there's the can, help advance policies that are politically realistic and ethically desirable. He sees several signs that these changes are in fact happening now or emerging. He talks about the surge of nonviolent civil resistance movements as documented by social scientists such as Erica Chenoweth and Maria Stephan. He talks about the expansion of cosmopolitan understandings of democracy, not only at the national but at the transnational levels. And he talks about the growing capacity for global governance through the expansion of the rule of law at the international level. So I'd like to push at the edges of this vision, challenge it a bit, by noting several additional reasons why this vision of change is really hard, coming from my perspective as a social movement scholar with a particular focus on the recent global protest wave of the past decade. So I've got three points, three questions coming from them. So first, while I share Bob's excitement about the surge of nonviolent resistance movements, the recent wave of global protest has a lot of contradictory tendencies within it, not all of which are progressive. While some recent movements have toppled corrupt leaders or dictators, talk about Guatemala, Sudan, others have resulted in returns to militarized repression, as in Egypt, or continued devastation by civil or interstate wars, like Syria or Ukraine. Likewise, some massive citizen uprisings against corruption, austerity, and inequality have fueled the emergence of progressive new political parties and electoral coalitions, as in Spain, Chile, or South Korea. But in other cases, they've steered the countries in opposite directions, helping to set the stage for the rise of extremist populist governments with xenophobic and autocratic tendencies, such as in Brazil, the country that I've studied, the Philippines, and India, again, to name a few. So my question is, how do we deal with these contradictory tendencies in recent global protest when trying to build a transnational movement? How do we respond to the fact that some of these recent movements seem to be heading in the opposite direction from the ideals that Bob lays out? So second, even within what we might call progressive movements for equality and inclusion, many activists are questioning the strong divide between nonviolent and violent protests as posited by social scientists such as Chenoweth and Stefan. Scholars of classic nonviolent movements such as the US Civil Rights Movement or the Gandhian independence movement note that in some cases nonviolent protest works by provoking violent repression, or certainly by creating confrontation and friction. David has written about this. Moreover, the labeling of contentious action as violent or nonviolent, as terrorism or freedom fighting, as a riot versus a march, are often loaded with assumptions based in racial, colonial, and economic forms of domination. As Dr. King famously said, a riot is the language of the unheard. The border between violence and nonviolence is often messy. It's based on the moment-to-moment unfolding of relations between challengers and power holders, including the dynamics of state repression. So my second question is, how do we wrestle with the moral and political dilemmas of this messy boundary between violence and nonviolence in today's movements and today's protests? And third, many progressive activists themselves, of the kind that Bob wants and needs in the transnational coalitions that he describes, are quite skeptical about state institutions in general and about international governance institutions in particular. Many activists defend a kind of radical horizontalism or radical autonomism that seeks citizen power in the multitudes outside of hierarchical state power. Large swaths of the climate justice movement have given up on international climate convention framework negotiations after seeing too many failed talks. Even the successful negotiation of the Paris Accord that Bob celebrates and that we've withdrawn from has been seen as too little, too late. So these efforts, along with international human rights frameworks, are under critical challenge, not only for their weaknesses, but for being dominated by global capitalist interests and Western value frameworks. And then from the other direction, right-wing movements have attacked the climate accords and other UN treaties and conventions as a form of Western liberal secular domination. So the third question is, how do we rebuild trust in global institutions and the notion of governance in general, when these are subject to skepticism and critique from both the right and the left? How do we push beyond the temptation of many progressive activists to sidestep formal institutions altogether? So I see some tension and some contradictory historical dynamics in the areas where Bob sees signs of hope. But because I really want to reinfuse myself with Bob's humanistic realism and his realistic optimism, I want to close with 2 points that I think are convergent with Bob's vision, where I think that we can find some hope. I see hope in emerging types of hybrid activism, which understand, like Bob, that we can't abandon governance institutions at local, national, or transnational levels, although we can't rely on them either. Some activists are building creative insider-outsider coalitions in which institutionally based activists within government or other agencies or other organizations ally with external challengers who use more provocative and confrontational tactics to avoid cooptation and to pressure to create the friction that generates deeper challenges. You know, we need these kinds of insider-outsider coalitions at all levels, from local municipalities to multilateral governance institutions. I also see hope in the challenging conversations that are going on within many institutions, including here at Notre Dame, about things like racial justice, about the continuing legacies of colonial domination, and about the complexities and the difficulties of pluralist debate. Our colleague Jason Springs talks about, in his recent book, the idea of strenuous pluralism, reminding us that these kinds of really probing conversations about justice, freedom, mutual responsibility, and democratic process are not easy, and they're often quite conflictual. Yet, as Bob knows, these kinds of conversations are necessary, and they're happening uncomfortably and generatively all around us. So the challenge, as Bob will continuously remind us, is to move these conversations from the purely local and the immediate to always keep broader layers of transnational community in view. And I take to heart both Bob's exhortational and his possibilistic modes. I take to heart his must. I also take to heart his could, and also his pushing us towards the can. Yes, we can. Si se puede. That's always echoing through this book. The politics of possibility pulls us forward, and I'm so grateful for Bob's always challenging, always prophetic vision and voice.
Thank you very much, Anne. Wonderful comments and thoughtful questions from each of you. Now we'll give Bob a chance if you would like to come up to the podium and in 5 minutes or so summarize your responses or thoughts.
I'm intimidated by the quality of these comments and my inability to respond quickly in very meaningful ways, probably, to them. But that's a way of saying deep thanks to each of the three of you for these really profound comments. And I have to say, I think you understand the book. I think you have correctly captured what it's about and what I'm trying to do and what I want to work at. And the reason I so frequently talk about listening and about democratic processes is I am very consciously aware of my failure to have the answers. The answers aren't within me. The desire to find them is there. The answers are with you, with others who can be activists. The answers are usually with the oppressed. Now, if we can communicate with them and hear them and deliver for them, then we have a coalition that's going to provide the friction that's needed to make the change, I think. Just a few small or less abstract points. I mean, I think David is right about the international women's movement not being sufficiently addressed in the book. That's true. It certainly wasn't my intention to not do that, but I just didn't have it in my consciousness, and I should have, or should have had a co-author who would bring that in. I also think there's hope in the world's largest peace movement, or peace protest that we saw at the time of the U.S. invasion of Iraq, but, of course, it wasn't enough at that time, but it can grow, and it is kind of impressive to recognize how large protests were all in many different countries as the U.S. publicly approached the possibility of invading Iraq. And it is impressive that the UN Security Council said no. It is a shining moment in that regard. This kind of thing, of course, has a negative consequence. I don't mean the UN, but the U.S. invasion. I think it sure made it easier for Russia to invade Crimea in 2014. If the United States can invade Iraq without any UN authorization and without any very effective argument that there's self-defense makes it necessary, those are the only justifications for an act of aggression. And here's the U.S. doing it. So very hard for the U.S. to effectively protest when Russia moves into Crimea. I'm glad, David, you're going to do a new book. You don't have to, but you've got it within you. And if it can be the joy of resistance, I'm going to be your first purchaser. Mark, your comments are so much on target, and your questions, such soul-searching questions that are right on target. I don't know that I can. I just have to say this has to be a continuing conversation. I can't do justice to them. But I can say you're fairly persuasive on the point that to ask a country that's on a suicidal path to be the place we look for leadership to solve the problems. That's pretty effective. I don't need you to do a book before I concede the point on that one. I guess, the answer I can give is it's a personal one. And I sort of alluded to it earlier. I'm a U.S. citizen. And my students, especially the international students, kept reminding me that I am a U.S. citizen. And what am I doing about it? I'm living here in privilege and in luxury. What am I doing? I'm talking about it. That's not enough. And so I tried to state a case. It's still scholarship, it's still privilege, but I tried to state a case that shows where people can stand who want to change the world. And this was the best case I could make. And though I don't know that the United States is going to be the place that you find the support of or the leadership you need, I still have kept hoping, because it's where I've grown up. Keep hoping. And I have an entitlement, I think, to talk to my own fellow citizens in this way and say, you better shape up, or it's not just bad for everybody else in the world, it's bad for the United States too. It's oversimplified, but that's the message. So do not, and I've said this so much to Europeans, do not wait for the United States to assert leadership before you assert leadership. It's not going to happen that way. And I think that if David's points are correct, and I think they are, we have to have friction. We have to have pressure, public pressure. We have to have civil society movements. Those are going to arise, if they do, in the United States from women or from those who are people of color or who are discriminated against because of sexual orientation, or those are the people who are going to assert the political pressure. But internationally, it's going to come elsewhere. The U.S. is finally going to make some changes that it does not want to make, at least the elites don't want to make, because it's required to make them by pressures from elsewhere in the world. That's why a transnational coalition is necessary. It's not simply that we need people all over the world to act. We need to bring, and I say this, I think somewhere, we need pressure from outside the United States on the United States to help the United States do the right thing. At the same time, the United States has enormous potential and capability, and it can do enormous good if it's able to bring itself to do it. This reminds me of one of the first debates I remember being part of years and years and years ago when I was first learning the benefit of listening outside the country. It was a debate about what the United States should do at that time. And the sort of thesis was, well, the United States has to assert leadership, but it shouldn't be too arrogant. It should be first among equals as it exercises this leadership. And Johan Galtung got up and he said, why should the United States be first among equals? Why not just another country? Lots of power, lots of money, but why even first among equals? Now, that stuck with me because, I was tuning into this, first among equals. And then I thought, well, why? Why not just one additional country? And so even the progressives at that time were thinking about being first among equals. And I may unconsciously have conveyed more of that in this book than I should have, and that you and others like you may help make me sensitive to. So thank you for that. I won't try, limited time, to comment on the role of social media and technology, because I'm just not smart enough to do it. But I do think this is creating an entirely different political reality for us. And already it seems to compete with the nation state for how much good or how much bad it might do, if I oversimplify. It is a new political reality, and I don't think we begin to comprehend yet what its meaning will be. But I'm sure we should go to it with a critical eye because of the enormous power it has. Critical eye, and trying to adapt the values that we hold to be what we're committed to in tension with what these media can do. Thank you for reading the acknowledgments. And you picked up a point there that's valid. I agree with you. And I think if I live long enough, you and I should talk more about this sort of fundamental inner commitment to value that affects our politics, and how to draw upon it in a way that doesn't become doctrinaire, ideological, proselytizing, or threatening to those who may not have the same inner call. Again, that's why democratization is so important. We listen to each other. I'm not recommending we go to court on that first thing. And your comments also so helpful. I can't quickly give answers to them all, but there are contradictory tendencies when public protests can be used for purposes that are counter the humanitarian values of human dignity that I hope the book is committed to. And your second question about the messy boundary between violence and nonviolence. Again, I can't tell other people where they should stand on that, but I think for me, I'm still persuaded by Chenoweth and Stepan, and to some extent by Gandhi. For me, I know one thing I don't want to do in life. I don't really want to kill somebody else. If I have a choice, I don't want to kill anybody else. And so I'm inclined to come down on the side in thinking that nonviolent protest is going to be okay if it does stick strictly to nonviolent conduct. When it doesn't, I'm not going to be the first to judge people, especially if it's a liberation movement, but I'm not probably going to be endorsing that myself. So this isn't very helpful, but it's a personal effort to figure out where to stand. For the activists who've given up on global initiatives, again, I think I understand that, but let's face it, globalization, for good or ill, is not going away. And so we have to deal with the global community, and we just explained that and keep hoping that people understand they can't really be free locally if they don't relate globally. I think it's no longer possible, given the way the world is interconnected. And I agree with you, and thank you for partially answering your own questions, because you knew that there were partial answers that you could provide, and the hybrid activism is one example of that. One final thing I'll say, but I won't spell it out. I truly believe we have a choice between continuing the present path we're on, that is the sort of political realist path, or getting off of that. And I think if we stay on that path, in other words, if we potential activists do nothing or almost nothing, I think the future of the world is very grim. I think it's very likely that nuclear weapons or other weapons of mass destruction will spread. I think it's very likely in the next century that nuclear weapons will be used in combat. I think terrorism, because it's not effectively addressed by a quote-unquote war on terrorism, will continue to recur. I think the environment will cause enormous human suffering and probably violent conflict and unmanageable and irresistible pressures for migration and gross new violations of human rights. I think this is the future. If activists don't do enough soon enough, I think there's a lot of evidence that points in that direction. So the reason I remain hopeful is if enough people become aware of that and see that, it may mobilize us to do something. And if I have any choice on who to do it with, it would be the people I see in this room. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Bob. Now we'll have a few minutes left for questions, if we have any questions from the audience or from our attendees on Zoom, either one.
We will start with a Zoom question.
Okay, from Ron Pagnucco. Are there any lessons we can learn from the transnational freeze movement and European nuclear disarmament? He did not say who he wanted to take that, so maybe David?
Well, I just finished a review on a new book about the nuclear freeze movement. Yeah, I think the freeze was a success in shaping the political climate of the United States and pushing Reagan towards an openness to negotiate and leading to significant arms reductions. And there were a couple of aspects of the freeze that were particularly important to its success. First was the innovative nature of the freeze narrative itself, that it talked about disarmament as being on both sides. It got through all the technical mumbo-jumbo, all the idea of somehow you're pro-Soviet if you're for the freeze, because the freeze said stop weapons on both sides. People could understand it, and it went from being this arcane idea for people with PhDs or government officials to an issue that everybody had a concern about and could work on. Secondly, that the freeze built power through grassroots local organizing. The idea was to have local initiatives or to have local associations or local governments adopt this simple proposition, freeze the arms race on both sides. And it had amazing success even in states where Reagan won the election, and in local districts people would vote in favor of the freeze. So it was like a populist prairie fire that spread across the country. And the third factor of success was that it was able to benefit from and build partnership with the religious community with moral values. So almost every religious institution in society backed it. As we know famously, the U.S. Catholic bishops issued their letter on war and peace, and endorsed, if not the freeze proposition itself, the idea of mutual verifiable halt to nuclear weapons on both sides. And therefore there was a mantle of respectability and of legitimacy. And you could not attack the freeze as being pro-communist when it was supported by the U.S. Catholic bishops, and also by Jewish leaders and all the other religious communities. So those three factors, the importance of aligning with religious communities, of working from the bottom up in the local communities, and then having a convincing organizing narrative.
Excellent, thank you.
Anyone in person have any questions?
Yeah, any question down here?
Thanks, Lisa. For David. In the Netherlands, there is this NGO called Urgenda, and they sue, together with something like 900 citizens, the Dutch government, accusing them of not fulfilling their duties regarding global warming emission cutting. Another Dutch organization called Milieudefensie, with a number of other people and organizations, sue Royal Dutch Shell because of the same grounds. Would you say that these new developments are something like 21st century way of mobilizing, like you were doing in the 80s on the streets of Manhattan, or you would say that it's not the way to go ahead suing in courts, in national court in this case, Dutch national courts?
Yeah. No, I think these are good strategies and tactics. When the question of the use of the law and of the courts came up earlier, I was thinking to myself, the courts are not the only solution, and often they are establishment-oriented and will not make decisions against power. But they're part of a broader movement. You know, I sued the U.S. Army when I was in the Army. I knew the chances of winning were 0. But it was because it was a way of organizing among other soldiers, drawing publicity, and helping to spread the idea that soldiers could talk back to the Army. And I think the climate movement has many innovative tactics. The Extinction Revolution, rebellion, sorry, that's in the UK and other countries. And it causes a lot of disruption, sometimes anger against the movement, but it's necessary to draw attention. And in my view is that this movement is having a powerful impact. Thankfully, we had this measure adopted in the Congress, which is only limited, but it's moved us farther along in this direction than we ever imagined. And there's significant more progress towards reducing emissions, towards alternative energy production than we had seen in previous years, because we've created a global consciousness, the movement. There are a lot of problems within the movements. I think what Anne said about movements being able to manage pluralism in our societies have really hurt some of these movements. The Sunrise Movement was this powerful new force that came along. It was very big here on campus, and it's almost disappeared because of internal problems. And how do you bring people of color and others into the leadership of what was previously all white males? These are tough questions. But I think the global climate change movement, the movement against climate disruption is having an impact, and it's the cutting edge of social mobilization in many parts of the world.
Great. We want to allow time for some closing comments, but are there any last questions from the audience? Over here. Okay, great. We'll have maybe 2 minutes for each of you if you would like to make any final comments. Oh, there was a question over here? Oh, one question here. Sorry. Thanks, Lisa.
This is a sort of major concern, and was brought up by your comments and by Bob's. Are we at all prepared for this? Do you see any preparation going on for this massive migration that's going to happen when the seas rise and the food is diminishing because of the dryness? It seems to me that in our interest to really develop ideas of peace, this is going to be a powerful, in my limited ability, I see it as unstoppable move, because people are going to have to survive. So the question is, do we see on the horizon any kind of real consideration, aside from the general talking about, well, we've got to bring the emissions down, of what we're going to do when these people go on the move?
Anyone have any
Defer to
answers
my
to?
colleagues.
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, I don't study the climate, but my sense is I don't think it'll be, it's incremental. So I don't think the moves are going to be like one massive migration as much as the sea levels begin to rise, the storms get bigger and bigger, and eventually people start to move, and that'll change how our cities look. Places with money will probably be doing fine. They'll build seawalls and other forms of defenses, so Manhattan will be fine. Miami may be a little bit less so. But the real effects are going to be felt in the places that are already feeling them, where they don't have the infrastructural capacity to withstand the ever stronger storms. But I mean, it's something that, even though I study different aspects of global politics, I mean, it's something I keep coming back to. You know, the Pope said that the environment is, and this wasn't this Pope, this was actually Pope John Paul II, if I'm not mistaken. The environment is the biggest threat to humanity, or what's happening with the environment. So it's something that scholars must be attuned to. And I'll use those as my final 2 minutes because I know we're over time.
Great. Wonderful. Any other final comments, Anne or David? You'd like to give?
I don't have 2 minutes worth of comments, but I just wanted to say I'm just always moved and amazed just to hear Bob talk and the way that he can move between like the harrowing and the ebullient, you know. So it's like this is combining sobriety and joy that's a gift. So, and I'm really grateful that 2 generations of Misches have been able to work and learn with you. So thank you, Bob.
Can I just quickly say again, thanks to you, Bob, for helping to create this institute and for putting it on such firm foundations within the scholarly world and in the policy world, and even in social movement engagements. And this institute is a force itself to try to address many of these problems. And with our 700 graduates and larger number of undergraduates who are out there in the world, Father Ted's army of peacemakers that you've helped to design and you're managing it, that's a force for positive change.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I would just add that I feel very lucky to have been able to work here with Bob for 35 years at the Kroc Institute, and have heard many of these themes that have been talked about today discussed in the halls and the classrooms over the last decades. So it's wonderful to hear them now analyzed and reflected on. And I know particularly for Bob, it's been wonderful to have not only a strong mentor like Richard Falk, colleagues like Anne and David and Peter Wallenstein and Josefina reflecting, but particularly to have a number of his former students, the alumni from the program, Bina and Isis and Mark and Shabi and Alex and Raul. It's wonderful to have you all come with all your perspectives from over the years, the decades, the different parts of the world that you bring your perspectives. I know for Bob it's been like a little reminder of the excitement of being in the classroom and what you learn from your students, because he's certainly true that that we learn more from our students, I think, than they do from us in many cases. But I wanted to just end with a comment that I think we would probably all recognize, that I heard from one of his former students, that, you know, reading this book, all through the book, I could hear Bob's voice. And anyone who has worked with Bob and studied with Bob will probably recognize that, you know, his voice is all through there, his heart, his spirit, his thoughts, and analysis and reflections, all of that comes through in the book, and we're really grateful that you've shared it with the world and that we get then to discuss it further and analyze it and discuss it further with you. Thank you, Bob. And thanks for all the participants.